In this video, I will demonstrate how to use tone curves in Adobe Lightroom CC. Find an image where you want to adjust the tones or contrasts in the photo. If you're not quite sure what photo to use, start with a black and white image and experiment with the settings first. Click on the Edit icon, the panel for value, and find Tone Curve. This drop-down will bring up the curve grid, and this button turns the tone curve on and off. This first icon controls the parametric curve, which we'll come back to. Instead, click on the second icon, the gray circle, for the point curve. In the background of the grid, you'll see a dark gray image with peaks and valleys, which is called a histogram. This is specific to the midtones, shadows, and highlights in the photo, so yours will look different from mine. At the bottom left of the diagonal line, if you click, you'll add an anchor point. And then if you pull up on that point, it will lighten up all the black parts of your photo. If you move the anchor point down, it will darken all of the blacks in your photo. The bottom left corner is always associated with the darkest black tones of an image. Next, add an anchor point on the diagonal line at this cross section on the grid. Moving this point up will always lighten the shadows in your photo. Moving it down will darken the shadows in your photo. So this point is always dealing with shadows or other dark tones in the image. Right-click on the grid if you would like to remove an anchor point from the diagonal line. Choose Reset Channel. Next, add an anchor point to the middle of the grid. Moving this point up will lighten all the midtones in your image, and moving it down will darken them. Notice that because I removed the previous anchor points, it does move the entire diagonal line, so the darkest shadows are also being adjusted as well. Add an anchor point to the top cross section of the grid, and moving that point up will lighten the highlights in the photo, such as the leaves outside my window. Moving it down will darken them. Notice that my darkest shadows are not being affected because I have the anchor point in the middle blocking any movement of that part of the line. Finally, add an anchor point to the top right. Moving this point up or to the left will lighten all the white in the image. Moving it down will darken them or make them look more gray. I'll right-click and reset the channel before showing you a popular setting for the point curve. Start at this cross section at the top right of the grid, add an anchor point, and then move it up to lighten up all of the highlights in your photo. Then go down to the bottom left cross section, add an anchor point, and move it down to darken the shadows in your image. This creates a dramatic contrast between the lights and the darks, and it is called an SCurve. It was made famous by Instagram as one of their filters. And you can fine-tune this SCurve to make it more or less contrasted. You can also take the anchor point at the top for the whites and move it down, and take the anchor point at the bottom left for the blacks and move it up, and create a matte effect, which is another popular throwback filter. If you just stopped the video here, you'd have a good understanding of tone curves, but let's dive in a little deeper. I mentioned the histogram in the background. The peaks and valleys correspond to the shadows, midtones, and highlights in your image. So looking at mine, it has a limited amount of highlights and whites, and it's mostly consisted of midtones and shadows. So you can use the information in your histogram to decide how to adjust your curve. You can place anchor points at these peaks and valleys and adjust them to either even out the contrast in your photo, and you can use this button to compare your changes to your original image and then continue to fine-tune all of the tones. I'll reset my channel again, and this time let's take a look at the RGB curves. Here we have the red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel. Click on the circle for the red channel. At the top left of the grid, you have the color red, and the bottom right, you have its opposite or complementary color green, technically called cyan. You've still got the diagonal line going from the darks to the lights and your histogram, though it might have changed a bit since now it's analyzing the reds in your image. Now if you add an anchor point to the middle and you pull up, you will intensify the red colors in your photo. If you pull down, you will remove the red and intensify the cyan. You can also do the famous SCurve and try out the muted matte effect as well. And you can have fun and go really extreme with your color and create a two-tone effect. Let's reset this channel and click on the green button. In this panel, you have green at the top and its opposite or complementary color, which is magenta. Notice my histogram has changed a lot and has flattened out more evenly because I have green and magenta colors throughout my photo. I'll play around and do a dramatic S-curve here, and I'm not even sure if you can call this an S-curve, and that looks pretty silly, so I'll go ahead and reset and show you the blue channel. In this panel, you have blue at the top and its opposite or complementary color, yellow, at the bottom. And I'm back to a very lopsided histogram. This time, I'll lock in the midtones with an anchor point first before adjusting the lighter tones. And since my photo doesn't have a lot of tones of white, I can decide if I would like them to be more on the yellow side or more on the blue side. And I can adjust and try to balance the lights and darks while creating a sort of old-timey effect. You can make adjustments to all RGB channels at the same time. So I'll randomly add some points in to the blue, green, and red channels. And then if you right-click and choose Show All Curves, you'll see all the lines appear on the screen at once. The red and green are overlapping a little bit, so I'll go back to the green and adjust it so that you can see it more. And this can be useful as you're considering how all of the colors are working together in an image. And then you can right-click and choose to reset all the channels. And I'll also turn off the option to show all of the curves at once. Let's go back to the point curve and click on this icon, which is the target adjustment tool. This bar will pop up on the bottom and it matches the panel on the right. As you move your cursor over your photo, you'll notice that an anchor point on the diagonal line will represent where that tone is along that line, whether it's in the shadows, the midtones, or highlights. Click on an area of your photo that you want to adjust, like the brightest whites. Then a slider will pop up and you can slide to the left to darken those tones throughout your picture. Notice that it also drags the diagonal line down on my grid. Now I'll click on a dark tone in my picture and move the slider to the right to lighten those areas. And you can click on a midtone and do the same. You can come down to the bottom bar and click on the photo to make changes to the RGB tones as well. I'll right-click to reset all those channels. And lastly, we'll come back to the first icon, which brings up the parametric curve. The histogram and diagonal line are the same as the point curve, only now when you go to place an anchor point on the diagonal line, you'll see a bubble appear around the point. And as you move along the line, the bubble shifts. This bubble is representing the area of tones that will be affected at that point as you move the anchor up or down the grid. Up at the top, for example, I would only be affecting a small portion of the highlights, and you can see it tells you that down here. As I move down the diagonal line, the bubble gets larger, affecting a larger portion of the midtones. And back down to the bottom left, I would impact a small portion again, this time the darks. So let's put an anchor point in the center and drag up. And you can see the shape of the curve mimic the shape of the bubble. So this is the area of tones in the photo that were lightened. You also have sliders at the bottom for shadows, midtones, and highlights, and you can click and drag to fine-tune the anchor point and darken or lighten those tones. I'll go ahead and right-click to reset, and now I'll use the parametric curve to create the S-curve for a stronger contrast. I'll click on this icon to compare my changes to the original. And once you get it where you like it, the final step is to export your image, clicking on the share icon, using custom settings, and I'll include my watermark, exporting it to my Creative Cloud files in a folder for this unit, and click Export. And that is how you use the tone curve to adjust the midtones, shadows, and highlights in your images in Lightroom CC.